Shehan, I saw one of your responses to Baylor and the reports about hiring Doug McNamee. We've known him, but this was not who I thought. I know his name was out there a little bit. Your thoughts about the hire? You're a Baylor alum.
Yeah, well, I think it was certainly a surprise when it first happened. And, look, I think that on its face, like, let's get to kind of the elephant in the room, right? He's somebody who hasn't worked in college athletics in 7 years. He's somebody who obviously has been in private business for a while since then, hasn't been part of the NIL era. But, I talked to some Baylor people that I really trust after the fact, right? And one of the things that they pointed to is he has a lot of background in, obviously, the relationships in this community. He's been part of 2 successful athletic departments at Baylor, both with Mac Rhodes and Ian McCaw. And also, of course, he is a master of fundraising and revenue generation. And, they kind of made the pitch to me, like, this is that moment where that needs to happen, right? This is a moment where having money or not is kind of the biggest existential threat facing this athletic department. Now, I think that, look, my opinion is still, I think that there are certainly other directions that they could have gone, where maybe you get somebody who has a little bit more backing in college athletics, who maybe has a strong background in fundraising as well. But I think that I understand a little better maybe sitting here today than I did when the news came out, why they went this direction. Now, there's going to be a big learning curve. I don't think that there's any doubt about it, right? Stepping into this ever-changing world of college athletics with new rules every single day, new figures, Congress, like all these dynamics that Doug McNamee did not have to be a part of during his 7 years at Baylor before. But I'm curious to see how he handles some of these new dynamics.
One thing I will say, and like Swookie said, we know him. I like Doug as a personal friend, but I don't know. Like people ask me, how do you think he'll do? I said, well, I don't think it's completely up to him. I know he'll work really hard at it. Like it's, I know that he will give it his all. So that what I can tell you about Doug. But the other thing I'll tell you is that Doug's a Baylor lifer, so that in a good way, this is not a stopover job for him. So I do think that, especially in this moment with Baylor, that's more of a benefit than, it's a notch on the resume. This is his dream job.
No, 100%. And I think that matters, right? I think that being able to come into this community and already have a large amount of backing and a large amount of credibility of people in the community, obviously, like you mentioned, the people who have been in the media for a little while as well, like that stuff matters, right? Like to not have that learning curve. I mean, I talk about a learning curve with obviously settling into the job. That's a learning curve that he won't have to figure out, is learning how to navigate the Baylor community and obviously some of the corporate interests as well around. And I mean, it's been well reported, right, that he obviously was very involved with fundraising going back a decade to when I was a student over there hanging out with you guys as well. And so, I think that all that stuff is very well taken, right? And like you said, I mean, so much of this job is going to be dependent on factors that aren't him. I mean, I think that Baylor probably doesn't make this kind of hire if they don't have a president like Linda Livingstone, who's been very involved in the national college athletics landscape. I think that if you don't have some really familiar faces like Scott Drew helping to lead the way in the athletic department, to not have to make some of these key hires. But that's also, I think, the sort of interesting and sort of big risk of it as well, is like there's a pretty good chance, not necessarily that it's going to be next year, but in the next couple of years, he's going to have to make a football hire. We know that he was on the selection committee that picked Matt Rule, which was a tremendous hire, of course. But he's going to have to potentially make a football hire. Maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, it could be a basketball hire, a women's basketball hire, right? So those are, I think, some of the unknowable dynamics. But again, what's kind of been said to me by some people that I trust is, if we don't have the revenue piece figured out, none of the rest of this stuff matters. And I think that that's a pretty compelling case, at least.
So, Shehan, the Baylor, there's still a lot of work to be done. Like I've asked, just like Paul, well, I don't know if it's the right hire. Could they have, because Linda Livingstone mentioned something about a Power 4 AD, and then she kind of explained that a little bit yesterday. But let's get to college athletics. I don't know if you heard the Jamie Pollard audio about how he was talking to Rodgers, knowing Matt Campbell was probably going to leave, and yet he was basically all but tampering and admitted that because he needed to know, because he knew Matt Campbell was going to leave. But it's just a cycle. And then we have all the players get to leave whenever they want. And it's all about legal and all that. Is there really ever going to be any time where we have this stuff together? Is this going to be the way it's going to be forever?
So I think the 2020s is going to be this moment of dynamic, transformative structural change, right? Because, I mean, again, I mentioned it, 2016 was when I graduated from Baylor, when I was still down there with you guys. And to think about where college athletics was then versus how much it's changed just since I've been a professional in the industry, it is totally unrecognized. I mean, I was a full-time professional in the industry when Baker Mayfield was suing over having to sit out for being a walk-on, right? Like, this is crazy stuff to think about at this point. So I do think that we will come to a resolution. I think that the House case is kind of that first big thing, right? This is a legal precedent that's going to set the perspective of how we move forward. I think that what gets interesting now is, okay, the next piece is going to be, is there any legal enforcement, period? Right? Because so many of them have been challenged in the courts. Maybe that comes through a congressional act like the SAVE Act. Maybe it comes through the CSC managing to get all colleges to sign on. Maybe the CSC kind of believes they already have that authority and they managed to really go after somebody for going after over the cap in an illegitimate way. But that's kind of the next thing we're all waiting on, is to kind of see, okay, look, where is enforcement going to come from, and how rigid is it going to be, and how enforceable is it going to be? I don't know if that's going to be figured out by this time, by the middle of next year. I don't know if it's going to be something that takes 2 or 3 years to figure out, but I think that that's the next step. And once we get that figured out, I think it's going to slow down just a little bit. Again, we are in between, let's say, 2022, 2023, and 26, 27, I think that that's going to be seen as basically the no rules era of college athletics. I think that we're going to settle down a little bit, but again, it probably won't come in the next 6 to 12 months.
Sean, I think the biggest thing needs to come in an admission from the leaders of this sport that they're going to have to sacrifice some of the money that they are hoarding in order to save it. They've got to say, look, we can't just run in opposite directions and then be reactionary where, whether it's realignment, whether it's a TV deal, whether it's all these things where the SEC does one thing, the Big Ten responds, the Big 12 and ACC now have to respond. The G6 schools just have to sit there and go, okay, and figure it out, when they could, they actually going to have to work together and admit some things that they don't want to admit, whether it's the G6 and the P4 don't need to be in the same playoff and they don't want them in the same playoff. So let's just operate under something that we can admit that we don't want you and we're going to move on this way. Players are employees. We have private equity that's investing, so we have team owners now. Let's just admit these things and then build from there.
Yeah, I think that that's going to be a big part of it, like you said, is structuring some of this stuff. But, I want to go back to something that you said at the beginning. I think that when you're in this position right now where everything is so unstable, I think that, we've had this era of the haves and have-nots historically, right? Everybody knows that Texas has a lot of money and that Iowa State has less money. But I think that we're in this moment right now where all the haves are kind of fighting with each other for supremacy, right? It's that, I've talked about it in the context of the coaching carousel, right? Arkansas thought they had this coach, all of a sudden Auburn wants him. Auburn thought they had this coach, all of a sudden Florida wants him. Florida thought they had this coach, suddenly LSU has, right? It's this constant churn and one-upsmanship and trying to shape, kind of the sport in their favor. Obviously, all this stuff with Notre Dame being among it, the conversation we had about Texas throughout the month of November. And I think that that's going to be something, like you said, where a lot of the people who run this sport and a lot of the biggest voices in the sport are going to have to come together and say, what do we want this to be, right? Do we want ultimate consolidation? Do we want more and more teams to start getting kicked out until we've got 5 teams? What do we want this sport to be? What's the structure? What's the postseason? Who's involved? Those are questions that at some point the leaders of this sport, which are not necessarily the president of the NCAA, it's also the presidents and athletic directors at Texas and Ohio State and Michigan and all these schools, they're going to have to sit down and figure out, again, long-term, what do we want this sport to be? Because we can't be doing this perpetual arms race forever. That's just not realistic. That doesn't serve anybody. That's not quality for anybody. Frankly, it's not legally defensible when you get to the court system as well. But until that happens, I mean, and this could be something that's kind of brought from up on high, right? Like maybe Congress comes in and says, this is what sports are. I don't know. That's sort of, again, the $1 billion question that's being asked right now. But right now, again, we're in this perpetual arms race, and ultimately it's going to leave everybody broke.
Yeah, it's frustrating because you get ADs who say what, like Jamie Pollard said, or you get a coach like a Kenny Dillingham says what he said, and then you get, but it's like everybody's doing this from different parts of the continent instead of in the same freaking room. Like it drives me crazy that there have to be committees, and those committees, all they do is schedule another committee meeting rather than getting things done. And I would, if you had coaches and ADs and presidents all in the same room where they could speak the way they really feel, I don't know if they'd ever get anything done, but it'd be a lot easier. At least let's give it a shot.
Well, and this is one thing that we've seen, right, is that actually the SEC and Big Ten athletic directors have held meetings essentially with that group to try to find some consensus. But this is one thing that I think is really complicated, is that there are some disparate interests, right? Like the Big Ten wants certain things that the SEC is not willing to give them. And I think that the other thing too is that a lot of these stakeholders as well are afraid of staking their claim on something and being wrong about it and not being able to get out of it later. I mean, I think that's even when we talk about the playoff system right now, that's a huge part of what's happening, is that, everybody wants to say, well, should we be at 12? Should we go to 16? Should we have, auto bid? Should we have whatever? Like a lot of it is they're waiting to see, okay, well, what are people mad about with this playoffs, with this particular bracket? Let's complain about it next time, right? Like I think that nobody, even when we get these people in a room together, are necessarily looking at the long term of the sport. Everybody's so short-sighted about it. Now, I think, again, that brings up the question of whose responsibility is it to look long term? What stakeholder who's part of this has a vested interest in the long term of it? And I think that that's probably one of the most unanswerable questions, because the answer right now is very few people.
Does Notre Dame look like a billionaire who's complaining that their private jet was late?
I won't say that exactly, but I think that so look, I want to be clear. Like, Notre Dame should be upset about how things were handled with the College Football Playoff Committee and the rankings. And I think that they deserve to say the way that you guys handled the rankings were ridiculous. I think that also they have done just about everything possible in the last 72 hours to make themselves look as unlikable as humanly possible. Because, again, like, Notre Dame is acting like they've been slighted by this sport when actually they are the most advantaged program in the sport, right? We talk about the idea of college football playoff governance. The management committee is made up of the 10 conference commissioners and also the athletic director at Notre Dame.
Yep.
After the playoff rankings were revealed, Ross Dellinger over at Yahoo reported that apparently Notre Dame signed a memorandum of understanding that if they're ranked in the top 12, they're essentially given an auto bid over any potential basically the last auto bid. So if that had occurred next year, then Notre Dame would have basically used their influence within the system to get in over Miami anyway. So, like, this is really not the test case that we need for and the sort of figure that we need, sort of making the case that the sport is messed up or broken or doesn't work for everybody, because Notre Dame is in a very unique place in terms of the way that the sport works for them. So I think that, look, I expect that we're going to get conversation about the system. I expect that, again, I hope that this sends a message to the playoff that we can't have the rankings handled this way, that we need to maybe understand what we're doing with these weekly rankings and how they impact a lot of these teams. But again, I think that Notre Dame has made themselves as unsympathetic as they possibly could through this process.
When I was growing up, and Shehan, as always, we appreciate your time. When I was growing up, I hated them because, well, they, and again, there was the aura, the mystique. I love the tradition, et cetera. But yeah, it was kind of like, man. And then they became irrelevant for not a long time, but they haven't won a national title since '88. But they still bring in big numbers. And now they're going to get an exception next year that if in the top 12, they get to go in the playoff. They're bitching at the same time. They've got a new thing that helps them next year. I don't know if I dislike anybody when it comes to that anymore, but Notre Dame can push the envelope.
Shehan, I just warned them as an FSU fan. I've seen this playbook before. It does not work out well karmically.
No, it doesn't.
Hey, well, no wonder they didn't want to be a part of the bowl game, right?
No,
but it's it is just to close things out. It is funny because, like, again, I'm 31 and like I don't really remember national title caliber Notre Dame, right? Like it basically until, obviously they make it to the title game last year. We have the Brian Kelly season in 2012, but like Brian Kelly Notre Dame is kind of like the peak of what I remember them as, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't remember Lou Holtz Notre Dame. I don't remember, going way back to one of the great programs of all time, right? Like I think that there's a little more risk with the way that they approach things than maybe they do. And it'll be interesting to see, again, if you make the ACC mad and they don't want to do that scheduling agreement with you, well, you've all of a sudden got to schedule 12 games, and that ain't easy.
Absolutely.
That would be a huge issue for them. So I think there's a reason that we're already starting to see Pete Pavakwa, their AD, back off from some of his takes already.
Thank you, Shehan. Shehan Jeyarajah with us, CBS Sports with us on Tuesdays. We appreciate his time.